following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Garden Gate. Today we will be, quote, visiting, unquote, our National Garden in Washington, D.C. via our guest, Marta McDowell. Marta has written several books on gardens, including All the President's Gardens, which is an interesting history of the gardens surrounding the White House. So sit back and enjoy today's episode, and perhaps it will inspire you to visit the gardens on your next trip to Washington. Hi, I'm Linda Temporino. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Garden Gate. Today we have a very, very special guest. She drove up in this dismal weather. Yes, I did say dismal. That's my favorite word. It's dreary and dismal. You'd never know it. It still feels like March out there. But her name is Marta McDowell, and she's from New Jersey. And she's written several books on gardening, one of which is the Little House on the Prairie Garden and the Beatrix Potter Garden. And she's up here, and she's going to be speaking on a garden that is most interested to me, and that is the gardens of the White House. It's the history of the gardens of all the different presidents. Welcome, Marta.
Thank you,
for
Linda.
coming.
Pleased to be here.
Yeah. So how long have you been writing gardening books now?
Well, let's see. I started around 2000 doing garden writing. Mm-hmm. And so, boy, time flies, right?
And what was your influence? What got you started into it?
Oh, it was almost an accident. So I had a corporate job. I wrote a lot for that. Mm-hmm. I was always an avid gardener outside of work. And then when my company decided to fund my midlife crisis with a nice big separation package.
Oh, how nice was that?
I decided that I would go into gardening and garden writing full time.
Wonderful. So these are the three books that you've had published.
Plus Emily Dickinson's Gardens, which is now out of print. It will be back in print next year with a
wonderful.
New edition. Yeah.
And you have written for Women's Day.
Yes.
Colonial Gardens, is it? Or
Country Gardens.
Country Gardens.
A lovely magazine.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the New York Botanical Garden.
Yes, I teach there as well, but I do special projects for them. So sometimes when they have an exhibit or a special publication, I get the chance to do a piece of writing for them too.
How wonderful is that? Who was the first president who lived in the White House that started the gardens? I know George Washington never lived there. Is that true?
That is very true. So John Adams was the first president to live there, but there wasn't really any garden when he moved in 1800. In fact, Abigail Adams joined him a couple of weeks after he had moved in, and she wrote back to her daughter in Massachusetts and said, "We have not the least fence, yard, or other convenience."
Because they were from a very agricultural community.
Yes, and they had a really upscale farm. When you say farm and then you go visit the Adams farm in Quincy, it's quite a lovely place. Mm-hmm. So she was used to something quite different, and she moves into this building then called the President's House that wasn't completely finished, because that letter went on to tell her daughter that she was hanging her wet laundry out to dry in the unfinished receiving rooms. Now, John Adams wanted a garden, and he actually asked for one, but they only stayed in the President's House really less than a year, because he lost the next election. It was toward the end of his first term.
It was just the last year.
Yes.
that they lived there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they didn't, really have a garden. Jefferson moves in.
Well, he was the gardener.
Yes, and so I, of course, expected to find that he had done all sorts of gardening on the grounds. And that really wasn't true because he was also just getting the place finished. He did have a retaining wall built and sort of defined what would be the front and back, you know, the carriage entrance and the visitor entrance. And he did some indoor gardening, but not much outside. He planted some street trees around the city. So for those of you who are involved in your local community's street tree planting, you're in good company with Mr. Jefferson.
We have a great program here in Nashua.
Very
Yeah,
important.
so,
Very important.
okay. So after the Adams moved out, and was Jefferson the next one?
Yes, so Jefferson moves in.
Okay, and he did what that was so spectacular in the White House garden? What did he add to it?
Well, he had indoor plants. So in terms of kind of the history of gardening in America, which is what I was trying to say, that was the story I was trying to tell, was how did garden styles evolve through our history, and how could I tell that in an efficient way? Well, I could look at what happened at the White House through the years, and that would be like my little snapshot, or, you know, a way to keep that story framed. So Jefferson grows plants indoors, which is interesting because you say, well, this is 1801 to 1809. He's a two-term president. It's fairly early for growing house plants. It's just at the beginning, because really, to grow house plants, you need heat, right? You need an effective
Absolutely.
source of heat. And so probably the president's house had a little better heating system than others. And he also had big south-facing windows, right? Because the White House is a north-south facing, you know, that's the way it's set up. And so in his office, he grew on plant stands potted geraniums, right? You say, well, okay, lots of people grow geraniums. But then it was a very unusual plant. It was right when they were being introduced from South Africa, so it was really an exotic plant. He grew some kind of roses in containers, so they were probably one of those little miniature roses. And he had a bird cage, which really was my favorite part, for his pet mockingbird.
Is that right?
Yes.
A mockingbird.
Yeah, so that would actually be illegal today.
Yes, I
can't-
was thinking
yeah,
that.
you
It's a
can't-
wild animal.
You can't cage wild birds, you know, not allowed. Then it was really common, and that surprised me. But I went back through old catalogs, and I found all the way up through the early 1900s, so into the 20th century, there were still catalogs selling mockingbirds. And you can imagine, they have a wonderful song, right? So if you want a songbird. And Jefferson loved them. He loved outdoor mockingbirds as well, but he often had one as a pet. And we even know the name of this particular bird in the White House was named Dick. And I thought, how wonderful that we even know this bird's name.
Clever.
Yeah.
Clever. And when did the vegetable gardens come into the garden? Or did they come first, the vegetable gardens, and then the ornamentals?
Same time. So Jefferson does some planning for the grounds. He actually writes out a plan with Benjamin Latrobe, who was an architect. And then the next president, James Madison, who was also one of Jefferson's pals, comes in, and through his administration, all sorts of plant orders get sent out for trees, for shrubs, things like roses and rose of Sharon, lilacs, and all sorts of vegetable seeds. So it was, again, really a small farm because they were supplementing the table, right? They were growing things to put on the table, and why waste all that land? Plus, they were all farmers. So that would have been something very normal for them to have a big kitchen garden.
How many acres does the White House sit upon?
So it's 18 acres. That's changed a little bit over time, but pretty much since Jefferson, that's what it's been. And then the square across from the White House grounds, Lafayette Square, that's also been there essentially from the start. and the Washington Monument grounds, which abut the White House grounds on the south side. The Washington Monument was started in the 1840s. So again, that's been federal land. And remember, they built this city on basically open land, swamp, some farmland, quite a bit of farmland. And there were a couple of villages, Georgetown and Alexandria. But basically, it was open space that they said, okay, this is going to be our new federal city.
Which president had the most impact on the gardens?
Oh, interesting question. So the one who was the most active gardener was actually John Quincy Adams, so Abigail and John's son. He learned how to garden while he was president, and he was quite smitten with it. You know the way people, when they're a new gardener, they get really enthusiastic about it. So he was well into adulthood, had never been a gardener. John Quincy Adams was a lawyer, and he was a diplomat. He had started working very young in Europe, knew a lot of languages, not a gardener. But he kind of discovers it. The gardener, the head gardener, who was an Irishman named John Ouseley, starts to teach him, including all of the botanical names of plants. And John Quincy Adams absolutely fell in love with trees and started planting all sorts of
I thought Washington did as well, did he not?
Washington also loved trees, but remember, he died before anything could really be planted in this new city that would bear his name. So he didn't really live to see it. He had wanted a botanical garden right on the grounds of what became known as the White House. That never really happened, although other botanic gardens in Washington did develop. And there are so many beautiful trees on the White House grounds that you can practically think of it as a botanical garden.
Right. The Rose Garden, the Kennedy Rose Garden.
Yes.
Was that Jackie's idea, or was it really the president's idea?
It was really his. She, of course, was, this style icon. I can remember, watching what she wore, and she had that wonderful televised tour of the interior right after she and her committee had done that big redecoration inside. But he came back. They had gone on this diplomatic mission to Europe, and they went to places, around the continent, and then they went to Buckingham Palace, to the gardens there. And he got back and felt, I think, that we weren't quite up to snuff. And so he called a family friend, Rachel Lambert Mellon, and asked her if she would help him. She was a horticulturist, she was a known designer, and so they actually worked together, she and the president. She gave him a copy of Jefferson's garden books, which he read. And they came up with a plan and went to install it. And really, it's been the design that's been followed since then. So since the 60s, that's a really long time to have a single garden design. In fact, they've entirely replanted that. But with the same plants.
Are they mostly tea roses, hybrid teas?
They're mostly hybrid teas in terms of the roses. But tomorrow I'll show a picture of the rose garden, and you can't even see the roses. It is a spring shot, but there are Catherine crab apples, big line of those, so they're very fluffy and full of these pink blooms. There are loads of tulips. So they ordered 3,000 tulips for the first planting. And they're in these very tidy beds, along with roses, and then these Kingsville dwarf boxwoods around the edges. So it's a very pretty plan. They put in a lot of annuals as well, so it's very colorful. And the president wanted a sort of, almost theatrical place where the president could make an address. And if you think about the Rose Garden, there's generally a podium out there, and then behind the president, the honorees could be at a slightly higher level. So that's what she and a landscape architect designed for him. And so there really was some theater about it. And I think that the best gardens are sort of theatrical. And remember, that was when television was really getting popular. And so the Rose Garden, since then, has been used for a lot of news conferences, as well as lots of other things.
Yeah. Which of all, there must be many different little gardens all over the property.
Yes.
Which one is your favorite?
Oh, well, I am particularly fond of the kitchen garden because
Oh.
that brought vegetables and fruit back to the White House grounds, which was part of the tradition. So I think that's wonderful. And of course, Mrs. Obama put it in. Mrs. Trump has said that, she's going to keep the kitchen garden. So I think that's a really nice addition because it tells an important part of the story. And if I could pick another one, my other favorite really is just the trees. The trees are absolutely magnificent. And they've been planted really since the beginning. The oldest ones no longer survive, but they still try to propagate them. So during the George H.W. Bush administration, the oldest tree on the grounds had another lightning strike. It was, the second one, and they had to take it down. It was an old elm that everyone felt was planted by John Quincy Adams.
Oh my.
So very sad. But the gardener at the time, he had taken cuttings and grafted them onto new rootstock. And Barbara Bush planted one of these small elm, really saplings by that point. And so still parts of that same tree, if you think of their DNA, are still growing. And so there's a long tradition. They have nice tree labels that say, this tree was planted by so-and-so. Rutherford B. Hayes planted this tree. And, so it's living history, which I find really very thrilling. And they're really beautifully kept.
How many gardeners do they have on their staff?
Well, there's a head of horticulture. And I think there were about, I'm trying to think, I visited there once and sort of trotted around after the head of horticulture. And I'm going to say there were about 8, and then some other people who kind of help on the maintenance, and they do all of the setups of chairs and things too. So they're not just constantly doing horticultural work. They pitch in on a lot of other things. They certainly seem busy.
If you could change anything in any of the gardens, what would you like to see? What would you like to see changed?
That's interesting. They're beautiful. They're full of tradition. They do try to have 2 open garden weekends a year so that people can see the grounds because they're hard to get access to. And I think that's the thing more than anything, that if I could wave a magic wand, I would somehow, fix the security, which is a real thing. That's the reason why they can't just have them more open. But it's hard to see them. And in fact, even since I finished this book, they've actually, you can't even get as close to the back fence as you used to be able to, because of course they had all that
Security.
problem with people climbing the fence. Why do people climb the fence?
They want to get in and take pictures.
I guess so. I guess so. But it's a shame. But again, they do the best they can.
How does the public find out when these open periods are to see the gardens?
What I did was I called my congressman. And so I don't know if there are other ways. They don't seem to post them online, or at least they didn't when I was checking regularly. I think, scheduling is always an issue. But I called my congressman's office, and they were very helpful because you do need a timed ticket. And they got them for
Just
me.
like for the White House.
Just like for the White House. And you do have to go through a certain security procedure, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
But it was really nicely run. They had the Marine Corps band playing. Lots of people attended, but it was really fun.
Wonderful, wonderful. Do you have plans for a next book coming up?
Well, after this reissue of Emily Dickinson, I'm really not sure. I keep kind of asking. As you could tell, I'm interested in writers who garden. And so I said, well, what about Frances Hodgson Burnett, Did you read the Secret Garden? A lot of gardeners like that book. I'm not sure. I said, what about L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, the Oz series? He was a gardener. He loved to grow dahlias and chrysanthemums. I don't know. So who knows? We'll see. If anybody's got any ideas, they should write me and let me know.
Okay. Well, I thank you so very, very much for traveling up here and visiting us, and I hope you have a lovely visit.
Thank you.
And I know that the President's Garden, I believe, is in the National Library, but you can purchase it
Absolutely.
at Barnes & Noble.
Your local independent bookseller?
Yes, yeah.
Online, in the
Online,
usual places?
Amazon.
Yes.
It's on Amazon as well. So,
Absolutely. They all are, which is really nice. Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life is in its 6th printing, which is just wonderful for a gardening book because that doesn't always happen. And The World of Laura Ingalls Wilder just came out last year, and that's done very well too.
yeah. Her book, the Laura, were there a lot of in these books? Did they have a lot of listings of plants or for that era?
So the Little House Books is a series of 8 books, and they were farmers, really kind of not very successful farmers. They kind of scraped along. So they mostly were doing vegetable gardening and grains. So her father always wanted to grow corn or wheat. But lots of wildflowers. So the Little House Books are full of wildflowers and wild plants. And so I went through all of them and made long lists, and I went through her letters and diaries and came up with something like 200 plants that were mentioned in all of her work. So that's quite a few.
And it was quite a few for that era.
Yeah, so I like to, in the back of my books, to have lists of plants that people could put in their own gardens if they want to. It's why my garden's so crowded.
What is your favorite plant?
Oh, that's like asking someone what their favorite child is. It's always like, well, what's my favorite plant that's in bloom right now? Then I would probably say my snowdrops. But, then they're all going to be quickly out of bloom. And then it'll be, well, the daffodils. And then, oh, well, those forget-me-nots. And then I love the peonies. And,
The peonies.
I love
the peonies,
irises.
yeah.
And, I love primroses and foxgloves. But a lot of things I've tried because I've read about another gardener growing them. And so, then I try them out and see how they work.
Wonderful.
How about you?
As you say, someone has said to me, what was your favorite garden? And I said, the garden that I'm in. Same type of a question. I love the lilies, with the Asiatic lilies, and roses,
Yeah.
and peonies. And I just ordered orange iris, a bright
interesting.
orange iris. And I ordered 9 of them, and I'm going
Wow.
to plant all of them in front of my generator in an attempt to camouflage it, because they had to plant the generator in the middle of my perennial border. I
Oh,
was
dear.
very despondent over
It's
that.
very sad. It's very hard. I know Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter's name was Rose. She was named after the prairie rose. And she was quite a flower gardener. And so there's one point where she talks about ordering 75 lilacs. 75, can you imagine? But some of them still bloom at their home in Missouri. They lived actually most of their lives in the Ozarks, which is not something that she really wrote about. But you still see the lilacs bloom.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to have those long-lived plants.
One of the gardens that we did for Beyond the Garden Gate, it was not last summer, it was the year before that. It was a garden in one of our budding towns. Hydrangeas. He has over 300 hydrangeas. Absolutely the most beautiful, just gorgeous. The vibrant blues and the purples, and they just go on for years and years and years.
It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
I know it's a little far beyond your garden gate, but this summer I'll be the gardener in residence at the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, Massachusetts.
Well, that's a very short trip.
Yeah, that's not too far
No.
from here. And so I'll be up there 5 different times for, almost a week each time. And they have old lilacs that we think probably were there when Emily Dickinson lived, from the 1830s to the 1880s. And, that's, again, it's a little bit of living history. It's a little connection that
Well, if you take care of those plants, they will last you forever.
Yeah.
I have some forsythia that was planted in my yard in 1960 when the house was built. It's still blooming.
Oh, I know.
And it
yes.
bloomed in February this year when we had that, week of nice warm weather.
Yes.
And so I don't know if we're going to get a second flowering in next month or not.
Well, every year I think, will I actually get to see my star magnolia in bloom? And here we go again. It was about ready to open, and then we're having this little snow, just like you're having up here right now. We'll see.
And it nips the buds right, and then they're
does.
gone.
It does. Very sad.
Well, thank you so very, very much.
You're
This
quite
has been
welcome,
very
Linda.
enjoyable.
My pleasure.
I hope you enjoy our lovely state. I've
I
been
will.
through yours quite a few times on my way to visit my mother.
Well, we have some lovely gardens. New Jersey is the garden
state,
and
absolutely.
it's sometimes hard to remember that if you're just driving on the turnpike. But
Well, the Garden State Parkway is beautiful.
Yes, if you get off, there are many gardens that you can go visit.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. And hope you go online or go to a local bookstore and look for Marta's books.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.